we have an extraordinary activist in the District of Columbia coming before us. We should know that frequently change doesn't come with ease. There's a lot of pushing and frequently a lot of pulling that makes change possible. And there are activists who are centered in these activities. Asa Gordon, a historian, who's also an activist. He is working and helping to lead the Green Party at this very moment in a national case that is questioning the legitimacy of U.S. representatives from southern states. And that activity is going to be critical in the re-election of our current president, President Barack Obama. He is not only an activist on the local level with the D.C. Green Party and its Electoral College Task Force, but he serves with great distinction as the Secretary General of the Sons and Daughters of the United States Colored Troops. He's the Executive Director of the Douglas Institute of Government, and as I said, as a speaker, lecturer, and scholar, he brings to us a unique combination that helps us understand that this emancipation program and these emancipation activities continue the struggle of African people and of people who are focused on equality. Those persons who joined with African Americans to really create major change in this nation in the past, and it continues today.
I address you today as Major Fedumas, Francis E. Fedumas. Now, if you go on Wikipedia and you go on Google, you will think that Martin Delany was the only major who served in the United States Colored Troops. I want you to correct that. I also served as major. I was commissioned by Benjamin Butler in the 2nd Louisiana Native Guards, and I served as major, and I was the only major to lead those of African descent in the combat with the U.S. 74th USCT. Now, I would like to talk to you about a battle within a war. We of African descent in the Civil War, we fought on 2 fronts. We fought against a common enemy for our liberty, and we fought among our allies for our civil rights. Yeah, it didn't start with you, it started with us. We fought on 2 fronts. And in that battle, it was over the issue of equal pay, the issue of promotions. The issue of pay was that they paid a private, a white private in the Union Army, was paid $10, and he got an extra $3 for his uniform. We were paid $10, and we were deducted $3 for our uniform. So we had that private being paid $13, and we were paid $7. A ratio of almost 2 to 1. A mysterious ratio that seems to be constant between the status of those of European descent and those of African descent to this day in all economic matters. But that $7, I want you to understand, whereas among the Union troops, the white Union troopers, there was a graduation of scale. If you were a chaplain, you could get anywhere from $100 down to $13. The pay for a U.S. trooper was $7 private, $7 corporal, $7 sergeant, $7 sergeant major, $7 even if you were chaplain. But we took an issue to protest that. Robert Goodman of the 54th wrote a letter to Lincoln saying, "We have done a soldier's duty, we deserve a soldier's pay." we had such dignity that we refused to accept, even when Massachusetts, the governor of Massachusetts, said that he would make up the difference between our pay and the white soldiers. We refused it. Saying we are soldiers of the United States government, and we deserve to be treated as equals. And we refuse to accept the inferior pay. And one of the colonels at that time, Colonel Thomas Henderson, who led the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, he tried to get us to accept it. But later he was to admit that the colored troopers were wiser than us, the officers. They knew that if they accepted inferior pay as soldiers, there could be justification for that when the war was over. And so their families suffered. Some of our wives and children ended up in the homes. But our wives told us, don't you give up. Keep up the fight. And finally, our position was to embarrass the government to finally award us equal pay. Yes, we fought on two fronts. We were not satisfied at being limited to the lower ranks. We wanted commission position. Contrary to a certain movie, the sergeant major of the 54th Massachusetts was Douglas' son. Louis Douglas. And he was not satisfied with his position as sergeant major. He wrote a letter. He got a petition, among others of his rank, over 186 petitions to serve as officers, to command their troops. One of the most notorious cases was a Colonel Augustus, an African American who had to leave this country and go to Canada to get his medical degree. And when the war broke out, he was in a distinguished position in Toronto, Canada, a distinguished surgeon. And he offered to serve as a surgeon in the United States colored troops. When the white officers heard that they may be under the command of a black surgeon, they wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln. And they complained. They said, no one can deny that we, where our heart stands with respect to the Negro, but must we suffer the indignity of having to serve under the command of a Negro? They could not see the contradiction in that advocating because they were willing to serve as officers among the United States colored troops. Any inconsistency with them insisting that there was a glass ceiling, that they should not serve under them. But he became the highest ranking officer in the United States colored troops, Colonel Augustus. Now, the position that was taken by free blacks was best expressed by Frederick Douglass. He said, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, a mustard on his shoulder, or in my case, a sword at his side, and bullets in his pocket. And there's no power on earth that can deny he's earned the right to citizenship in the United States government. And the whites knew that. White workers in some of the states struck They say that if you hide, I'm talking about the North, I'm not talking about the South, I'm talking about whites that did not own slaves, took a position to deny the opportunity to blacks by saying that if you hire any blacks, we will not white any longer work for this company or this packing house. So our struggle was not only with the slave owner, but also some immigrant whites who did not own a slave. There was no justification then, and there's no justification now. The aspirations of those who had been enslaved was more immediate. That was best expressed by Private Thomas Long. His commander, Thomas Henderson, who had been one of the secret six that had backed John Brown, he recorded his remarks as Raymond chapter that day. If we hadn't become soldiers, all might have gone back as it was before. Our freedom may have slipped through the two houses of Congress, and President Lincoln 4 years passed by, and nothing been done for us. And now things can never go back, because we've shown our energy and our natural manhood. Another thing is, suppose you had kept your freedom without joining in this army. Your children may have grown up free and well cultivated so as to be equal to independence. But it would have been always flung in their faces. Your father, he never fought for his own freedom. No, never can say that to this African race anymore. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is how much that so-called ignorant slave knew about the government. 4 years, past the government 2 years. Many of us are not that educated today. One of the primary things, we won the battle over equal pay. We won the battle over promotion. My colleague, Mark Delaney, was commissioned by Abraham Lincoln himself, recognizing his leadership and role as leader of the Legal League, a clandestine organization that was instrumental for intelligence getting to the Union forces. After the war, even during the war, one of our primary goals was to secure, because the only way you can secure your rights is the right to vote. Now, I want to pass on to you how critical the black vote has been in our history. You know, I was looking back before I came to address this organization over the election of Lincoln, and I came across an article in the Richmond Inquirer, November the 2nd. And you know what the headline was? Ohio carried by Negro votes. And it goes on to say that if a judge had not allowed free blacks to vote, Ohio would not have been carried for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, we need to do some more research on that, because that is not in our history books today. The impact that the free blacks who were allowed to vote in Ohio may have had on the election of Lincoln. But there's one study that we don't need to do any further research on. When Ulysses Grant, the general who led the Union Army's infantry, ran for the presidency, he lost the white vote. Ulysses Grant became president because for the first time descent was allowed to vote in the presidential election. They were 12% of the voting population. And they voted overwhelmingly for Ulysses Grant. The white vote was necessary, but not sufficient. The black vote was necessary, insufficient. In the area of science, they call that a proof. That's how you establish a proof. So I want you to think about this. Let's pause here and think about that just a moment. If the black were not allowed to vote in 1867, I want you to understand that the right to vote, the 15th Amendment, wasn't passed until what? 1870. So blacks had to be allowed to vote for the right to vote. If those abolitionists had not disfranchised those former Confederates who would not pass the Reconstruction Amendment and enfranchise the former slaves, there would be no 13th Amendment. There would be no 14th Amendment. There would be no 15th Amendment. It took the former enslaved to be entrusted with the right to vote to reform the Constitution to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. That black vote would also be necessary and sufficient to elect the first person of African descent president of the United States. Now, without the black vote, let's do a little review here. We may not have had Lincoln, which means we would not have been an Emancipation Proclamation. We know there wouldn't have been a Ulysses Grant, which was necessary to enforce, at least for a while, under martial law, to turn back the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan to ensure the passage and adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And there will be no first president of African descent. Now, take a moment. What would this country look like if it wasn't for the black vote? No emancipation, no 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and not where we stand today. It was the crowning achievement of those veterans of the Civil War and what they knew that they owed those veterans of the Civil War to reward them for their service, that we can take pride in our Constitution. The proudest thing that we take in our Constitution derives not so much from the founding fathers, but from the founding abolitionists and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is fine. Let me make it clear to you. The 15th Amendment is not where you got the right to vote. The right to vote came to you in the second section of the 14th Amendment, where those white abolitionists punished southern states that would not allow their blacks to vote by saying, if you don't let your free blacks to vote, then you can't vote. You lose all your representation. And then they enfranchised their former slaves in their past. Let me tell you about my state of Georgia. Just a moment here. I'm from Savannah, Georgia, as you probably figured out. Georgia was so obnoxious that they sent back the same Confederate representative to Congress that they had before the war began. And those white abolitionists, without an NAACP, without an ACLU, but these white folks predicated on what was fact and what was honorable. They refused to seat those elected representatives from those southern states and then disfranchise all of those who had served in the Confederacy, have been loyal to the Confederacy, and then they enfranchise all those of African descent. And they passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. In Georgia, they sent down and put them under martial law And to add insult to injury, you put George on the march on the colored troops. Then they had a curfew. When the time came to vote, whites could not come out that day. And one of the laws were, if you saw more than 3 whites gathered, you figured they were up to no good, so you couldn't have them gathering in 3 or more. That's the way it was in Savannah, Georgia. And that's how it passed. You know, the high water mark in the Civil War, as historiographers would like to argue, was not at Gettysburg. It was not at Vicksburg. The high water at mark was not won on the field of battle, but in the hearts of man. The high water mark of the Civil War was when that war turned away from the preoccupation with the privileges of a race, but the negation of humanity to a downtrodden race. The Civil War turned when that war turned from a white man's war to a war of liberty for those of African descent. We look back to the past in order to illuminate the present so that we can have meaningful insight into the future. And history is telling, it is not enough that we be exposed to what has been ignored. We must confront what has been denied. Only then will history fulfill its promise of redemption for us as a people and as a nation. I thank you.